Hello, this is Dr. C, and welcome to part 2 of the Chapter 1 lecture for Introductory to Psychology. And again, this is the textbook we are using, as you know, from openstacks.org. So let's just dive right in. Briefly, the part 1 we covered, as you may recall, some of the major historical figures in the field of psychology and perspectives, such as psychoanalytic theory, behaviorism, and humanistic psychology, and leading to the newer field of cognitive psychology. So in this particular lecture, I'm going to focus on contemporary psychology. And these are the fields of psychology that are popular today. And if you go to the psychology professional website called the American Psychological Association, or APA.org, you will see different divisions within psychology that professionals and even students can become members of, and so that people within these specialty areas or divisions can exchange their research and talk about their field. The APA convention happens every end of summer, I'd say, early August, before the fall semester or quarter begins in an academic year. And this is a nationwide, even an international event where thousands, even tens of thousands of psychologists, can you imagine, would just arrive onto one major city where it's scheduled. And this year, I'm dating this video, but it was 2020, so it was held virtually for the first time. But I've attended before, but usually in places where I want to go, such as Boston, Washington, D.C., and Hawaii actually held it. It was also held in other major cities like San Francisco, where I've been to that one in particular. And I went to one also in Louisiana, New Orleans, and that was when Dr. Phil, the TV psychologist, made his first appearance. And that's a whole nother episode I'll talk about later. Okay, so let's take a look at the screen here, and you can see some examples. And this is not nearly a comprehensive list, by the way, guys. This is not a comprehensive list of the different fields of psychology. These are just some of the major ones. An Intro to Psych textbook would just have to double, quadruple in size if every single specialty area of psychology was included. So I'm going to give you an overview real quickly, hopefully, of each of these fields of psychology. And they do have roots in some of the older fields of psychology that we talked about last time. And also, this will also lead to careers in psychology as well, so I can talk a little bit about that. All right, so let's move along. Okay, biopsychology, a lot of people also know it as neuroscience or neuropsych. Okay, neuro meaning the brain. Okay, and this is the perspective. And again, let's focus on how these branches of psychology are also, you can think of them as perspectives as well. There are different ways of examining our behavior, and this is one particular way. In our last lecture, we used the example of depression, right? I don't know why I always use a question mark. Never mind. And if you were to ask a neuropsychologist what causes or influences depressed mood, they will likely focus on these things, right? The nervous system. They would focus on chemicals, right? They would focus on your neurodevelopment, right? They would focus on your biochemistry, your brain chemicals, okay? Neurotransmitters. But if you were to ask a cognitive psychologist, we talked about this field last time, that focuses on how we think, I don't think a cognitive psychologist would focus on any of these things, would they? They would focus on your thinking patterns, right? And possibly your emotions as well. So for those who enjoy biology, or perhaps you're a pre-med major, I think you'll enjoy this chapter in an Intro to Psych class. This happens usually early on, either chapter 2 or chapter 3 of any textbook in psychology. and you would study the basics about the brain and the nervous system, and specifically different parts of the brain and how they function. All right, sensation and perception. In my class, we're actually skipping this chapter, but this is also focused on biology. It focuses on our various senses and how they work, right? So you'll study the detailed anatomy of the eye, for example, the ear, and how and all the different sensory cells, receptor cells, and how we process information coming from the outside world. Because if you think about it, right? So sensation is the biology, perception is psychological. This is how we see the world, right? So here's, of course, one of those optical illusion type examples that you see a lot in psychology classes. About your senses is what your retina sees in your eye, but then your brain is the perception. What do you see? You see different things. Do you see a rabbit here, or do you see a duck over here, right? And so this can potentially be very interesting for those who enjoy psychology, especially biopsychology as well. So I think it's a worthwhile chapter. There are even entire courses just on sensation and perception. I've taken that course in college, my junior year, I think, back at University of Texas, and I thought it was a great class. But it's just not an area we'll emphasize too much in our class. Okay, developmental psychology is a major chapter. In fact, if you're studying at the community college level and you're studying nursing, chances are this second course, usually called Psych 200, is a required course for you. I also teach this class. Developmental psychology is also called lifespan. Now, a lot of people think when they see the term developmental psychology, they think the word development, they think, oh, this is child psychology. No, it's not. This is about our entire lifespan. You'll learn about genetics in chapter 1 all the way through death in chapter 15 or so, 16, or however many chapters your book has, okay? And one of the most famous developmental psychologists was Jean Piaget, okay? And his famous theory was called the cognitive development theory. So I'm not going to go too much into his particular idea, but the main idea was that our mental skills, our ability to solve problems had to do with our age. We had to grow into them. Okay, so you can't expect the reasoning of a teenager to be the same as the reasoning of a 30-year-old adult. You can't expect a 9-year-old to solve complex puzzles the way, let's say, a 15-year-old can. Okay, and so it's the age, it's our biological development that limits our ability to think, to have these kinds of skills, right? So we have to mature into them, not so much being sort of trained of these skills at a particular age. So it's a very well-known, fairly well-accepted theory in developmental psychology. So when you take a lifespan class, you will see Piaget's theory spread throughout the textbook based on various stages. And developmental theories tend to have stages, like 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay, in terms of what our abilities are at a given stage. What are we able to do? What is our mind able to do? What are we able to experience throughout our lifetime? Okay, so again, developmental psych, a whole major on its own. But professionally speaking, developmental psychologists tend to be researchers. Okay, so let's say you find a developmental psychologist who's a specialist in attention deficit disorder. Okay, well, you would not take your child to be evaluated by this developmental psychologist who's published many books on the subject, because they are a researcher. They are not a practicing clinician who works with patients and evaluates people. Okay, so in terms of careers in psychology, that's where a lot of people don't have a clear understanding. Well, the psychologist is a psychologist, right? Well, no. They're educators, researchers, and clinicians. All right, personality psychology, again, another very popular course all to itself. This is where we talk about the big names in psychology, like Freud, okay, Rogers, B.F. Skinner, all the names you saw early on in the chapter, right? And what is personality? This is how we think, feel, and behave. So personality psychologists basically are trying to ask, who are we as people? How do you define being human, right? What perspective, what is your theory going to be in terms of what we're made up of? So here's an example of a theory that's a model based on what a category called trait theory. Okay, so one of the categories of personality psychology are trait theories, and it's the idea that our personalities, what makes up who we are made up of ingredients that we call traits. Think of them as preferences. Okay, so this 5-factor model is trying to narrow down our human understanding into 5 factors. That is, who we are just basically different on these 5 basic traits. How open you are, how conscientious you are, whether you're extroverted or introverted, okay, outgoing versus quiet, how agreeable you are, how neurotic you are, how much you worry, okay, and how anxious you are. So every person is along this scale somewhere, okay, maybe this far, maybe in the middle. Okay? And there are different theories that you'll see in the chapter if you look under trait theory that look at different dimensions. You may have heard of a test called the Myers-Briggs, where you end up with a 4-letter code like ENTJ, which I think I might be, right? And so that all people are divided into these 16 personality types, right? This is an example of personality theory in terms of, well, how do we understand people? Well, we're just made up of a bunch of different traits, and this is what makes us similar or different than one another. Well, Freud would say that, well, personality is based on our unconscious mind, right? Or maybe our personality is based on learning from other people. Okay, so that's what personality theory, psychology is all about. Is basically major ways of thinking, perspectives of understanding who we are as people. It's almost like philosophy in a sense. Are we basically good, basically evil? Are we like animals? Are we more like robots? Are we like computers, etc.? Okay. Social psychology is another popular field in psychology. And I think whatever your major is, I highly encourage you. I cannot recommend social psychology enough. I was a social psychology major. This is my first graduate program. I went into a social psychology PhD program. And I left after 4 years, basically maybe finishing 75% of it. And then I switched to counseling psychology. I wanted to help people more directly. Social psychologists tend to be researchers and write books and publish studies. But social psychology is basically how does an individual, how are they affected by our social environment? Okay, how does it affect our individual behavior when we're in groups, right? When we're working under an authority, do we become obedient? What is our attraction to one another? Prejudice and stereotyping. How does our mind work, right? So again, how we think, right? How we act are socially as individuals. How are we affected by our social environment? Social psychology is not the same as sociology. Totally different fields. This is part of psychology. It's focused on how an average person might behave in a given situation. Sociology is about group behavior. A social psychologist, let's think about mobs, okay? Or large groups of protesters. I'm not trying to say that protesters are mobs, okay? I'm just saying sometimes protesters turn into mobs and you have violent behavior, okay? So sociologists would look at the group of what would cause this group behavior to happen. What are the cultural aspects? What are the economic conditions that might create these kinds of things happening? But a social psychologist would focus on how would you behave in this environment, right? How would you behave amongst this environment, right? How does looting happen? How do you predict whether one individual is going to start breaking into a Walmart and stealing stuff? Okay, what social psychologists have found, and what's become sort of a theme that you can remember now if you like, is that situations are powerful. Okay, we underestimate them. A slight tweak in our environment can change our behavior entirely. We may do things we normally may not do, right? So oftentimes we tend to define behavior due to internal traits like your character, right? Who you are, your sense of who you are, that you identify yourself as an honest person. But under certain situations, would you steal? Would you rob? Right? Wouldn't that go against how you think of yourself? Would that situation change how you act? Right? So I think social psychology is a fabulous field of study. It can explain so much of what happens in our society. Those who are going to law enforcement or into the legal profession, I really encourage you to take social psychology. It really will change how you think about everyday behavior and how you judge people. Okay. Health psychology actually originated from social psychology, and so we'll see this in the health and the stress chapter in our textbook. Okay. All the factors that lead to whether someone's healthy or not. I had a job as a researcher during graduate school at MD Anderson, the Cancer Center in Houston, and we were doing tobacco research. Right? So this is under health psychology. Right. Now, even though we had lab coats on, we were not clinicians, in a sense, treating people medically. What we were doing is we were running studies on the different psychological methods to help people quit smoking. Okay? And so we learned early on what are some important factors or variables that influenced whether someone would quit smoking or not. And can you guess what? It's kind of an easy thing to guess if you like. A factor that would predict someone would fail almost every time. Okay? If they answered a questionnaire at the beginning, all these different questions, if they answered yes to this question, we kind of knew that they're not going to succeed. So what was that question? Is whether or not someone in your household is actively smoking, right? That environmental factor of having another human being who lives in the same house who is a smoker would greatly reduce the chances of that person quitting smoking. That was one of the things we learned. And also we learned that there are a lot of associations. Last time we talked about behaviorism. A lot of people smoke because their cigarette is tied to a certain action or a certain time of day, like after a meal or with coffee. And so if you try to break this association, right, then maybe you can break that behavior. It's interesting stuff. All right, clinical psychology. This was what I got my PhD in. Actually, the field was called counseling. Sorry, you try writing on an iPad. Okay, counseling psychology, right? This was my doctorate. Okay, the training is very, very similar, but they're in different departments in the colleges. Okay, so you don't need to know too much about that. But basically, we learned about mental illness and we learned how to treat them. So yes, I have training as a counseling psychologist. I did 3 years of training, 2 years at the doctoral level, right, in the VA hospital system, one in Houston and one in Los Angeles. And I tell you, after that experience, I have so much more respect for our veterans, whether they're combat or not, especially combat veterans, for what they went through, and how a significant percentage of our homeless population are veterans, which is really a shame, a national embarrassment, really, if you think about it, that someone serves our country, they end up homeless. And in Los Angeles, we were downtown, and you may have heard of this famous area called Skid Row. And we would walk up and down Skid Row talking to people. And if they were veterans, we tried to get them help at the VA. Now, the VA is not a perfect place. Some of you may know that some people have had problems getting good service at the VA hospital, but I had a positive experience there in helping people. And I've worked with all kinds of people, all kinds of disorders, and I'll talk more about them when we get to that chapter. But this is basically what most people think of as psychologists. Oh, you treat people, you treat the mentally ill, right? But it's a significant part of our profession, but it's not the only part of our profession, as you can see. Okay. I don't know how much more detail I'm going to go into this. We have a chapter on what's called IO psychology, and a lot of industrial organizational psychologists basically end up being consultants in large organizations, right? So you learn about what works and what doesn't work in a professional business environment in terms of what helps people become more productive and happy at their job, right? And a lot of these folks end up working in human resources departments. We have sports and exercise psychology. You may have heard about that. Psychologists who work with athletes to try to maximize their performance, right? How do you calm your mind? A lot of people say sports is 95% mental. A lot of baseball players say that. If you're a golfer, you know that, right? Hitting a ball that is not moving should not be difficult, but our mind often gets in the way of that, right? And forensic psychology, a lot of people think, CSI, right? Forensics. No, not the same thing. These are psychologists who basically test people who are standing trial to see if they're competent to stand trial. They do psychological testing to test their mental status. Are they competent to stand trial? Do they have mental disorders and so forth? And they become expert witnesses on the stand for either the client or for the prosecution. Okay? And so that, in a nutshell, is forensic psychology. And let's talk a little bit about careers. Now, many of you are in community college, so you're studying to get an associate's degree, an associate of arts, so that's 2 years of college, if you go full-time, right? Then the next level up is a bachelor's of arts or a bachelor's of science. So let's put a +4 for +4 more years. Okay, so that's 2 years of college. Obviously, you start with high school up here. Okay. Now, with the bachelor's degree in psychology, which is what I have, there aren't many set career paths with the bachelor's degree in psychology. You cannot, with some exceptions, unless you go into chemical dependency training, you can work and be a counselor in that area or work in group therapy sessions. But generally speaking, if you want to be a clinician and work with clients or patients, in that sense, you need a master's in clinical or counseling or a PhD in clinical or counseling. Okay? A PhD is required to be a university professor. You need a master's, or at least 18 credits of master's classes, to teach at the community college level, right? So I have a doctorate, which means I have taught at University of Houston. I could teach at a 4-year university, or I can choose to teach at a 2-year community college. And so I mentioned this before, a lot of us go into teaching, a lot of people become researchers. Now, you should know that if you're a psych major and you're going to go to University of Stanford or University of whatever to learn under a famous psychologist, when I was at University of Houston, my immediate professor was brand new, and she was a Stanford graduate who worked directly with a famous Stanford psychologist named Albert Bandura. You'll know his name later. He's the one who did the Bobo doll study, okay? Which you'll learn about later. It doesn't make sense now. But anyway, so I was learning directly under this very well-known, well-established instructor, a professor. So this professor is known for their research. Not all professors at the university level who are very famous are known for their teaching. Okay, You should know that community colleges hire instructors for their teaching skills. We are not required to do research. Okay? All right, so if your first 2 years of college, you want to save some money instead of going to the big name university and pay lots of money, you can take those similar classes at the community college level, and the experience in your class might even be better. I've had classes at the University of Texas where there were 300 students in a class, in a chemistry class, and I was sitting in the upper deck, right? There's no way you can ask a question. And I was taught by a graduate student, not even the professor, okay? All right, so you have clinical counseling psychologists, which are fairly close, very similar. Social work. This is what you can do with a bachelor's degree, okay? But you're probably better off getting a BSW, a bachelor's in social work. But if you have a bachelor's in psychology, then you can go on the graduate school and get a master's in social work. Why do I know so much about that? Because my wife is a social worker. All right. So again, industrial organizational psychologists can work as consultants, but don't feel like your major in psychology locks you into a particular profession. It doesn't have to be that way. There are so many careers now that are based on skills that even a bachelor's degree in psychology, you can transfer that into maybe a social media type job or whatever that does not require a license to work in a hospital, for example. Okay? All right, so let's look at this piece of the pie in this pie chart. So if I look at the colors correctly, this would be me working in a college, right? Okay, about another quarter works in hospital settings. And then you can think of others, half of us work in other, okay? So it's not, you can't just stereotype when someone says, oh, I'm a psychologist. Oh, okay, you must be a clinician. A lot of times they may be a professor who studies something so specific that they may not even answer a general question about mental illness or mental disorders. Right? So let's just give you a rough view of the variety of settings where someone with a psychology degree can work. But again, you want to plan ahead, okay, in terms of whether you want the PhD, you want the master's, what can you do with a bachelor's degree. Okay, you really do want to plan ahead if you're a psychology major. Okay, all right. I'm not going to talk about this one too much. This is just one of the slides that's included, but it just happens to be a statistical ranking of what people with a bachelor's degree in psychology happen to be doing. Okay, in a lot of corporations, you can just sort of get in at the middle level and work your way up and learn within the organization. And a bachelor's degree in psychology is sort of a foundation where you have decent, writing skills and reasoning skills and so forth. Easily you can get a sales job with a bachelor's degree in psychology. Probably maybe an associate's degree is good enough to do a lot of sales type work as well. And again, it's a stepping stone for social work, which is a very good profession and a very misunderstood profession, by the way. People just think social workers are the ones who take kids away from parents. But actually, it is, you can even get a PhD in social work, a doctorate in social work. Okay. Brene Brown, famous author that you may have heard of, actually went to University of Houston. That's where my wife went to school. She was 1 year, I think, or two ahead of my wife when she went to school there. So she's a byproduct of that social work training. Okay, and then you can work in business, healthcare, and so forth. Okay, what I like about the community college is that it's very skill-based, right? The further you go in traditional academics, that is the bachelor's, the master's, the PhD, is really training you more or less to be in academics, right? Think about my life, right? I got my bachelor's in psychology. I went on to get my PhD in psychology. And what am I doing? I'm working for a college, right? And so I've been in the college environment almost all my life. Have I had a real job? Maybe while I was here, right before high school, I've had a real job. But no, I've been in this sort of bubble of academics my entire life, okay? which I do not regret, but it's just sort of interesting to think about it that way. I haven't really wandered around and did a lot of different things, be a lumberjack, be an auto mechanic, those are things I really would enjoy, but I just haven't done. Okay, I think that's about it. This has gone on pretty much long enough. Give you an overview of the diversity of the field of psychology. So I know this is a lot of information, but just hang in there. And for my students, we use Canvas. Send me a Canvas email at any time. And for those of you who are out there in the interwebs and you happen to stumble upon this, if you want to ask me questions about psychology, you can. You can find me on Twitter at Jack B Teaching is my Twitter name. Okay. All right. So you can find me there if you want to. Okay, guys. Till the next video.